This first case focuses on a man named Mack Proctor, whose remains were discovered in 1972 in Polk County, Florida. For over 50 years, the identity of this man was unknown after his remains were found at a gruesome crime scene on May 17, 1972. A fisherman made a disturbing discovery near a canal in Eloise, Florida. There was this mass that he couldn't really distinguish at first, but as he got closer, he realized that it was a human body. The body he found was that of a middle-aged white male in an advanced state of decomposition. The exact location was just south of the canal and southeast of the US 17 overpass connecting Eloise to Winter Haven. The victim had been shot twice in the head with what was suspected to be a small firearm. The man had no wallet or other items on him that could lead to his identity. Needless to say, this made the identification process extremely difficult. The clothing the man wore was also unbranded, and there were no distinguishing marks on him either. Officials estimated that the man was in his 40s or 50s, but due to the level of decomposition, details such as the exact time of his death and his exact appearance were hard to determine. The man's remains were later buried in a pauper's grave at Lakeside Memorial Cemetery in Winter Haven, Florida. He was simply designated as John Doe. Back at the location where the man was discovered, officials were able to recover several .22 caliber casings. But aside from this evidence, authorities were forced to turn to the public in an attempt to gather more information. They released a description of the man, including his estimated age, height, and other characteristics, but as weeks and months went by, officials didn't receive any significant leads. However, 2 years after the body was found, police received an unexpected tip. In January 1974, an inmate at the Florida State Prison named Charles Williams requested to be put in contact with the Polk County Sheriff's Office. Authorities granted this, and Charles revealed that one of his fellow inmates claimed to have been responsible for killing a man, matching the description of the unidentified man found in Eloise. This potential culprit was named Clarence Ingram. Charles elaborated and said that, according to Clarence, he and an accomplice named Edgar Todd met the victim in a bar in Winter Haven in 1972. It's unclear if the three knew each other and the meeting was planned, or if they simply had a chance encounter. But anyway, that night, the three got into a heated argument. At some point, all three of the men were traveling in the same car, and Edgar Todd shot the man with a .22 caliber pistol. After ensuring that the victim was deceased, the two removed all of his jewelry and other items before disposing of his remains in the canal. Furthermore, the vehicle the group was traveling in belonged to the victim. The two culprits knew that the canal had a lot of animals, including turtles, and they were hoping that, over time, the animals would have completely consumed the remains. According to Charles, Clarence took this car and sold it. Authorities determined that Charles's information seemed too detailed to be made up, so they then set out with the goal of verifying the details. One of the first steps was to cross-reference the details provided by Charles with missing persons reports from 1972. Detectives reached out to law enforcement agencies in neighboring jurisdictions and states, particularly Georgia, where the vehicle involved in the crime had a license plate registered. This led them to investigate the case of a man named Lewis House. House had gone missing after traveling to Florida in 1972, and this seemed to be a promising lead. He had left Georgia for Florida and was never seen again, fitting the timeline and circumstances described by Charles. Detectives contacted House's family and gathered as much information as possible, but despite their efforts, they could not definitively link House to the unidentified victim. As a result, the investigation into House's disappearance did not yield the breakthrough detectives had hoped for, and the case went cold again. Nevertheless, they still decided to look into Clarence and Edgar. Their criminal histories lent some credibility to Charles's claims. Both men had indeed been in the Winter Haven area at the time of the murder. Records showed that Clarence had received a traffic citation in Michigan shortly after the time the body was discovered, which matched the story that the victim's car had been sold in Michigan for $500. And being that this rabbit hole didn't seem to be leading to the identity of the Eloise victim, it was dropped. As the years passed, significant advancements in forensic science opened new options for investigating cold cases. In February 2017, the body of the unidentified victim, buried for nearly 45 years at this point, was exhumed from its grave in Lakeside Memorial Cemetery. Once the remains were exhumed, the DNA extraction process began. The victim's DNA was sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. This facility had the necessary technology and expertise to handle such degraded samples and extract usable DNA. The extracted DNA was then analyzed to create a genetic profile of the victim. With the victim's genetic profile in hand, the next step was to search for potential matches in existing DNA databases. However, there were no results. This meant that the victim was not in the database, either as a known individual or connected to any other crime scenes. This was a significant setback, but not entirely unexpected, given the limitations of the database and the time that had elapsed since the murder. Fast forward another 6 years to November 2023. The case would see new life. A portion of the victim's femur was sent to a private laboratory named AAM Inc. Officials intended for AAM to use forensic genetic genealogy to find the man's identity. By April 2024, the research had produced promising leads. AAM's report indicated that the victim could possibly be M. Lavelle Proctor, a white male born on November 28, 1914. This identification was based on matches found in genealogy databases, which linked the victim's DNA to several distant relatives of Proctor. Detectives reached out to Wright Proctor, M. Lavelle's son, who was living in Georgia. Wright provided a DNA sample, which was compared to the genetic profile of the victim. The analysis confirmed that the remains were indeed those of M. Lavelle Proctor. Born in 1914, Mack was a skilled mechanic. He was described as a man who often moved around and had a history of heavy drinking, which might explain why his disappearance wasn't immediately reported to authorities. The family last saw Mack between 1969 and 1972, and he was never formally reported missing, likely due to his itinerant lifestyle and sporadic contact with family members. As for who was responsible for killing Mack, authorities went back to Clarence and Ed. The story from Charles only serves as circumstantial evidence, but officials are of the opinion that it's highly likely that these two men were Mack's killers. Clarence died in 1995, and Edgar died in 2015, so unfortunately, authorities weren't able to actually go back and confirm additional details. Back in the year 1981 in Texarkana, Arkansas, siblings Karen and Gordon Alexander were tragically murdered. For over 4 decades, investigators have been trying to figure out just who was responsible, not knowing that their answer was closer than they ever suspected. On April 8, 1981, 14-year-old Karen and 13-year-old Gordon were found brutally attacked in their home, suffering fatal stab wounds. Despite extensive investigations and public interest, the case went unsolved. Karen Alexander was known to be kind and dedicated among her family and friends. But behind this cheerful mask, Karen was actually hiding a life riddled with sexual abuse. As for her brother Gordon, he was described in a similar light. Gordon was vibrant and showed an immense amount of care toward other people. This trait would become evident in just a little bit. The events unfolded in the early hours of the morning on April 8th. Karen and Gordon's father, Weldon Alexander, returned home after a long night shift at Cooper Tire and Rubber. Weldon exited his vehicle and dragged his feet to the front door, looking forward to getting some much-needed rest. It was about 7 a.m. at this point, and Weldon noticed that his front door had been left slightly open. This detail worried him, so he slowly peeled the door open to enter his house. Once inside, he tiptoed around, expecting a thief or someone of that nature to be inside. That's when he made his way into the kitchen. Right there on the floor was his son Gordon, lying lifeless in a pool of blood. Weldon rushed to him, noticing what looked like stab wounds. He then called out for Karen and ran off to find her. Weldon later discovered Karen in the nearby living room. Karen was lying on a bed set up there, and she too was covered in wounds from a knife. However, unlike Gordon, Karen was still alive, but barely. Weldon called for emergency services, who transported her to a nearby hospital. Unfortunately, her wounds were far too severe, and she passed away just 3 days later. When investigators examined the crime scene, they were left with a complex and confusing scenario. The lack of forced entry suggested that the attacker was either known to the victims or had easy access to the house. This immediately raised suspicions and narrowed down potential suspects. One of the most crucial and peculiar details was the murder weapon. The siblings had been attacked with a butter knife. This was strange because it made the crime look like a spur-of-the-moment event rather than a premeditated one. According to Weldon, the knife was still embedded in Karen's body when he found her. After he called medical officials, he removed the knife and set it on a nearby bookshelf. Investigators explained this action as a panic response from the father, but it obviously raised concerns about contaminating evidence. Along with the butter knife, other evidence was recovered. This included fibers, blood samples, and other biological materials. Karen's autopsy later revealed some very disturbing details. She had been assaulted repeatedly in the months leading up to her murder, indicating a pattern of ongoing abuse. At the time of the attack, her brother Gordon was confined to a wheelchair due to a previous injury. This made him especially vulnerable and defenseless against the assault. The autopsy confirmed that Gordon had died almost instantly from the stab wounds he received. It is believed that Gordon was killed as he attempted to intervene and protect his sister during the attack. This act of bravery further highlighted the outstanding character of the boy and the bond he shared with his sister. Murdering a child, let alone one who was disabled in the way that Gordon was, outraged the local community from the start. Weldon Alexander was a person of interest due to his proximity to the victims and his discovery of the crime scene. However, his cooperative demeanor and the lack of immediate evidence against him meant that investigators had to tread carefully. They interrogated Weldon extensively, scrutinizing his alibi and actions on the night of the murders. Weldon maintained that he had been at work during the time of the murders and had returned home to find the horrific scene. One detail of particular interest to investigators was the fibers and traces of metal found on the two kids. These materials were ones that could be found at Weldon's place of work, but at best, this was circumstantial evidence. It was entirely possible that the material was transferred onto the kids after he returned home. In addition to Weldon, investigators looked into other potential suspects, including family, friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have had access to the house. Each potential suspect was interrogated, and alibis were verified, but no definitive leads emerged. Lucas was a notorious serial killer known for falsely confessing to crimes. In the following years, Henry Lee Lucas also claimed to be responsible for Karen and Gordon's deaths. His confession to the Alexander murders initially seemed plausible, given his known modus operandi and the detailed descriptions he provided. Lucas claimed that he had entered the Alexander home, assaulted Karen, and killed both siblings. He also provided specific details about the case, which led some unaware investigators to assume that Lucas had actually been at the crime scene. However, he primarily obtained these bits of information from reading about the case in public sources or learning about them through interrogations, where he was suspected of being involved. Ultimately, it was determined that Lucas was lying yet again. The case of Karen and Gordon Alexander remained cold for many years, but like with so many old cases, it saw a resurgence as technology evolved. In February 2022, Captain Calvin Seward, who had been involved in the original investigation, took it upon himself to reopen the case. Seward's decision was influenced by significant advancements in DNA technology and a renewed determination to bring justice to the Alexander siblings. Seward, alongside forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steffi and DNA scientist Kelly Dixon, began re-examining the evidence using the latest forensic techniques. They reanalyzed the biological samples, fibers, and other materials collected from the crime scene and obtained groundbreaking information that would ultimately solve the case. Underneath the fingernails of the siblings, officials were able to start building a genetic profile. This profile was further established after examining the semen found on Karen's bedsheets. If you recall, I mentioned that Karen was, unfortunately, a victim of frequent sexual abuse. I'm sure many of you suspected it by now, but the man assaulting her was her own father, Weldon. Investigators retraced the events back to the night before the murders. On April 7, 1981, events escalated to their peak. Investigators believe that on this night, Weldon attempted to assault Karen once more. However, this time, her brother Gordon intervened, trying to protect his sister from their father. Gordon's attempt likely enraged Weldon, leading to the violent exchange that resulted in the deaths of both children. The lack of forced entry at the crime scene further supported the theory that the attacker was someone within the household. Weldon's presence in the home provided him with the opportunity to commit the murders without raising immediate suspicion. Weldon's behavior and actions immediately following the discovery of the bodies also came under intense scrutiny. His account to the police included several peculiar details that raised significant red flags. The most concerning one, in light of the new evidence, was that he tampered with the butter knife and placed it on a bookshelf. Furthermore, Weldon's overall demeanor during the initial stages of the investigation was described as calm and cooperative, which initially diverted suspicion. However, as investigators re-examined the case with new forensic insights, his composed behavior began to appear more like a calculated effort to deflect suspicion rather than the reaction of a grief-stricken father. I wish I could say that this murderer faced justice, but that's not the case here. Weldon Alexander died in 2014, long before advancements in DNA technology could conclusively link him to the murders of his children. His death meant that he would never face trial or be held accountable in a court of law for his actions. If you're wondering about the children's mother, she actually committed suicide at the age of 37 in 1984. Her name was Vera. This final case takes us to Alamance County, North Carolina. In the summer of 1979, Tammy Sue Aldridge, an energetic 20-year-old student at East Carolina University, was pursuing a career in physical therapy with a focus on caring for the elderly. On June 30, 1979, her life was tragically cut short when she went for a jog and never returned. For over 40 years, the case remained unsolved. Tammy was born into a close-knit family in Alamance County, North Carolina. Growing up, she was known for her compassionate nature, dedication, and strong desire to make a positive impact on others' lives. At some point, Tammy became deeply aware of how overlooked and unfairly treated the senior population was. This led to her decision to study physical therapy in college so she could play a direct role in improving their lives. In the summer of 1979, Tammy was home from college, spending time with her family and preparing for the next semester. Her daily routine included jogging near her home. On June 30, 1979, what began as a routine jog turned into a nightmare that would forever change the lives of those who knew her. Tammy had always been safety conscious, jogging during the day and in areas she considered safe. Jim Barnwell Road, a relatively quiet and rural area, was a place she felt comfortable and secure. This path was a typical choice for her. When Tammy failed to return home at her usual time, her family immediately grew concerned. They knew Tammy well enough to recognize that she was not the type to deviate from her plans without informing them. As hours passed with no word from her, their worry escalated into panic. By the evening, her family reported her missing to the local authorities, triggering a search operation. The community quickly rallied to assist in the effort. Friends, neighbors, and local volunteers joined law enforcement in scouring the area for any sign of her. The search extended into the night and continued for days, covering the paths she was known to jog and the surrounding areas. Despite these extensive efforts, there was no immediate sign of Tammy. In the days following her disappearance, Tammy's family received 2 distressing phone calls from her. The first call came on Sunday, July 1st, 1979. Tammy reassured her family that she was unharmed, but her tone was unsettling. She sounded nervous, as if she were speaking under duress. Her family tried to ask her questions, but her responses were short and uninformative, adding to their growing fear. The second call came on Monday, July 2nd. This call was even more disturbing. Once again, Tammy insisted she was okay, but her voice was clearly strained, and it seemed evident that she was being coerced. Her family desperately tried to get more information, but their attempts were futile. Instead of reassurance, these phone calls only heightened their anxiety and fear for Tammy's safety. The family reported these calls to the authorities, who immediately escalated their search efforts. Law enforcement began to suspect that Tammy had been abducted and was being held against her will. The search was broadened to include potential hideouts and locations where she might be captive. Then, on the morning of July the 3rd, 1979, 3 days after Tammy Sue Aldridge went missing, her body was discovered along Highway 54 in Alamance County. A passing motorist spotted what appeared to be a lifeless body on the side of the road and immediately alerted authorities. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found Tammy's body in a horrifying state. Her ankles were bound with rope, and there were visible signs of physical assault. Her clothing was disheveled, her shorts were on backward, and her shirt was inside out, suggesting that her clothes had been hastily redressed after her death. The body was still warm when it was discovered, indicating that she had been killed not long before being found. This detail suggested that Tammy had been held captive for several days before being murdered and left on the roadside. An autopsy was conducted to determine the exact cause of death and gather more information about the circumstances surrounding her murder. The results confirmed that Tammy had been assaulted and strangled. The rope marks on her ankles and wrists indicated that she had been bound for an extended period, and the presence of rope burns on her neck suggested she had been strangled with the same rope used to bind her. The brutal nature of Tammy's murder sent shockwaves through the local community. The horrific killing of a young, promising college student shattered the town's sense of security and trust. Vigils were held in her honor, with community members gathering to mourn her loss and support her grieving family. Back at the crime scene, investigators recovered both physical and biological evidence. However, due to technological limitations at the time, these samples were not immediately useful. Law enforcement conducted numerous interviews with Tammy's family, friends, and anyone who might have seen her on the day she disappeared. They also questioned residents near Jim Barnwell Road and Highway 54, hoping to find witnesses who may have seen or heard something unusual. Unfortunately, the interviews yielded little actionable information. No one had seen Tammy being abducted, and there were no immediate suspects. In 2002, Sheriff Terry Johnson took over the Alamance County Sheriff's Office with a commitment to addressing several unresolved cold cases, including the murder of Tammy Sue Aldridge. His team began by reviewing the entire case file, re-examining evidence, and re-interviewing persons of interest. But once again, the case saw little to no progress. Then, in 2020, Detective Dan Denton, who had been assigned to the case, utilized modern forensic techniques to reanalyze the DNA evidence. He focused on a DNA profile obtained from a feminine hygiene product found on Tammy's body. This analysis ultimately led to a man named Lane Lafranbois. Gary had a criminal history, including charges of kidnapping and impersonating an officer shortly after Tammy's murder. Despite his past, he had never been seriously considered a suspect in her case. He had moved to Alamance County from Florida in 1978 and lived just a few miles from where Tammy's body was found. Gary served time in prison from 1980 to 1982 for those kidnapping and impersonation charges. However, much like the previous case, the culprit was already dead. Gary had passed away in 2020, the same year this major discovery was made. With no way to obtain his DNA directly, officials tested the genetic profile against those of his living relatives to confirm the match. In the end, it was determined that Gary was indeed Tammy's killer. What do you think? How do you feel about cases like these where justice is delayed, or in some instances, never truly served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And remember, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the twisted world of unsolved mysteries, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with fellow true crime fans. Together, we can uncover the truth.